Greetings and welcome to Theology Thursdays. We continue our study through Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. Today we are in Chapter 3, and before we get to the meat of Chapter 3, we need to talk about something that N.T. Wright brought up as how the order of this book is going to go. The first two chapters he has raised questions and issues around the ideas of what exactly do Christians believe about the resurrection, life after death, so on and so forth. And he's raised more questions than he's provided answers, which is the way that this particular book is set up. The first issue, the first thing that we have to deal with is the question of epistemology. Epistemology, very simply, means the study of how we know what we know. What are the things that we can know for sure about the world? What is the knowledge that we can rock solid say, this is true? Well, epistemology is one of the great areas of philosophy. Philosophy deals with what one famous philosopher would call conceptual engineering. And all of this is a way in which we are able to view the world in a reliable fashion. And philosophical questions involve what makes something something, what makes me me, and how can we know for sure what we know? What can we know for sure that we think we know, so to speak? And so we have to build from the foundations. We have to say, what knowledge do we trust? What counts as trustworthy evidence of something? When we jump off of this, we start asking ourselves, what are the areas of knowledge that we're dealing with? Are we dealing with a historical happening? If we are, what are the acceptable forms of knowledge that we can submit as evidence for or against a certain statement? Also, if we're talking about what one had for lunch the other day, we are asking the question not only of documentation, of written documentation, but we're asking the question about eyewitness. Okay, well, was there anybody with you when you ate lunch the other day? Can someone verify that you had that tuna fish sandwich for lunch? So we have another form of knowledge, not simply written knowledge, but knowledge of eyewitness. But what about the empirical sciences? How can I know for sure that when I combine sodium and chlorine, that I get salt, table salt, sodium chloride? What are the things that I can do to prove that that is the case, other than just saying that that's the case? Or what are the things that I can observe? What are the things that I can test? All of these various things. We are submitting ways of knowing reliably. And hence, we are asking an even more fundamental question than simply what can we test or what can we ask people about in eyewitness. We are asking the very question, what is true? What is the truth of the matter? That's what epistemology seeks to answer. Not merely what do we think about something, but how do we know that what we are using as knowledge is admissible to this particular thing? Into this epistemological study, N.T. Wright offers a very vivid story. The story goes something like this. On Friday, October 25th, 1946, at 8:30 p.m., in a large room in King's College, Cambridge, two of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century came face to face for the first and last time. It was not a happy occasion. Afterward, when those present compared notes, they could not quite agree on what exactly had happened. The two philosophers were Ludwig Wittgenstein and Karl Popper. Wittgenstein had already established a reputation for brilliance. Many were under the spell of his revolutionary ideas. He was the chairman of the Cambridge Moral Science Club. In Cambridge, moral science means philosophy. Many other philosophers, though, including Popper, regarded him with deep distrust. Popper was just making his name, having recently published the English translation of his masterpiece, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Both men had been brought up as assimilated Jews in pre-war Vienna. Wittgenstein in a wealthy family with the world at his feet, and Popper in a much more ordinary setting. Popper had longed for a chance to demonstrate the folly of Wittgenstein's ways, and now here it was. He had come to Cambridge to give a paper in which he would attack the great man head on. It was a chilly evening, the fire was lit in the grate, and Wittgenstein was sitting beside it. Many of those present were, or would become, household names in philosophy. Bertrand Russell, Peter Gish, Stephen Toulmin, Richard Braithwaite. Others went on to their professions, such as law. Many of them were still alive and remember the occasion well, or so they say. Popper did not know that Wittgenstein was not in the habit of listening to papers all the way through, or that he had a reputation for arrogance and rudeness, or that he frequently left meetings well before the end. Before long that evening, and this is where the accounts start to diverge, Wittgenstein had interrupted Popper, and the two men had begun a brief acrimonious exchange. At one point, Wittgenstein picked up the poker from the fireplace and waved it about. Shortly after that, he left the room and did not return. Within a short time, rumors went literally around the world. Popper got a letter from New Zealand asking if it was true that Wittgenstein had threatened him with a red-hot poker. From that day to this, the great minds present cannot agree on what precisely happened. Some say the poker was red hot, others say it was cool. Some say Wittgenstein waved it around to make a point, which wouldn't have been unusual. Others, including Popper, say he seemed to threaten his opponent with it. Some say that Wittgenstein left after an angry exchange with Russell, and after he'd gone, Popper gave, as an example of an obvious moral principle, not to threaten visiting speakers with pokers. Others, including Popper, say that he left when Popper said that to his face. Some say he slammed the door, others say he left quietly. It's a fascinating story and has recently been written up as an enterprising book. The main conclusion the book draws is that Wittgenstein probably left before Popper's remark. Popper's memory probably played him false. He had so much at stake personally and professionally that he badly wanted to tell the story as the story of his famous victory over Wittgenstein, so quite soon he did. And so before long, he believed his own account. Everybody disagrees on the precise details, but nobody doubts that the meeting took place, and nobody doubts that Wittgenstein and Popper were the two main adversaries, with Russell as a kind of senior umpire. Nobody doubts that Wittgenstein did at least wave a poker around, and that he left quite abruptly. Wright begins with this story, and he points to the question of epistemology. How do we know what we know? To apply it to this particular situation, how do we know reliably what happened at that particular meeting between Wittgenstein and Popper? Well, we have written evidence. We have those who wrote about it afterwards. We have, again, the letter from New Zealand asking, did Wittgenstein threaten you with a hot poker? We have obvious written evidence that is attributing to various layers to this story. However, notice that the written evidence occurs after the occasion of which it occurred. We then have to ask ourselves, okay, we have evidence that there was a poker involved, that Popper and Wittgenstein got into a heated argument, that Wittgenstein left early. That's all good and true. But now we have another way of submitting evidence. We have eyewitness. What did Bertrand Russell see? What did the others in the room see happen? What did the men themselves say about this encounter? Eyewitness testimony. In this case, especially with a room full of people who were waiting to hear two of the brightest minds in philosophy in the 20th century talk about moral imperatives. But, once again, we have differences as to how things happen. Some people say that the poker was hot. Some people say it was cool. Some say that Wittgenstein was simply waving it to make a point. I mean, we use our hands all the time to make certain points. Maybe Wittgenstein just seemed to need to have something in his hands tactically and just waving it. Or it's a cast iron piece of equipment that the man is waving around. One cannot fault Popper for feeling threatened, but also one cannot discount the fact that it actually could be a threatening movement toward Popper. Who is the referee deciding what is true about the situation? How did it exactly happen? Well, as Wright points out, there is actually a book that has been published about this very encounter and about the interesting dynamics present in the epistemological question. What is true about what we know about this situation? The reason why this is illustrated at the very beginning is because this is no different than the way that we as Christians have to begin our questioning and our search for answers about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We deal with similar issues. Think about the similarities between this example that Wright gave, a very vivid and true example, and the examination of what happened on that third day when it is said that Jesus was raised bodily. Well, we have writings that are developed. These writings happen well after the fact, after these have been passed through the oral tradition of storytelling. So there's something we have to examine historically. What do we mean by the oral tradition of storytelling? But also, not just that there are things written about Jesus, both by the Gospels and referenced by secular historians, such as Josephus and those others who understand who Christians say that they are. But we also have the eyewitnesses themselves, the disciples, Mary Magdalene, the women at the tomb, Joanna, and those who brought spices to anoint his body. We have all of these eyewitnesses that are telling a story. But as we know in the Gospels, not every Gospel describes the resurrection of Jesus Christ the same way. How are we to say that any of it is reliable? How are we to say that people just had hallucinations about this resurrection from the dead? People wanted to believe so hard that Jesus really was still present with them that they experienced his presence in a spiritual manner. Well, it all comes down to, what do we admit as evidence? And likewise, what can we epistemologically say is reliable ways of knowing the truth of the matter? Because any cursory look at the language of the New Testament, it is very clear that what happens on the third day after Jesus is crucified is something that is nigh incomprehensible, even to the people who witnessed it. Well, if these are the insiders telling the story, how can we say that this is not simply Karl Popper telling his version of the story between him and Wittgenstein, and he begins to believe it himself? Well, we have to ask ourselves, well, what do others say about the bodily resurrection? What exactly do secular philosophers of the time period of which we're talking about say about bodily resurrection? What do Jews themselves say about bodily resurrection? And then, what exactly does the New Testament say about bodily resurrection? And why is that actually far more nuanced than you might think? Because again, we're trying to establish what exactly happened on that third day. Why can we say, and say reliably, that we believe that it actually occurred, that Jesus was resurrected bodily on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, as St. Paul tells us? Well, in the manner like the Wittgenstein-Popper debate, the people who made their investigation about what is the truth of the matter of this meeting had methodologies in place and had a manner in which they admitted evidence and a way in which they adjudicated which evidence was more trustworthy or not. The first principal method that they used was they asked the eyewitnesses to ensure that reliable eyewitness testimony was on the table, to ensure that evidence to the things that are being said about this meeting are reliable. And the second method is to very carefully piece together the background, the historical situatedness of this particular meeting between Wittgenstein and Popper in their own contexts. What is Wittgenstein's motivations, life's work leading up to this point to lead to the conclusion that this has a possibility of happening? And likely, what is Popper's history, work, temperament perhaps, that leads to this particular happening as being a possibility? And there is a lot of work that had to be done around these two questions: the eyewitnesses and the historical situatedness of the reconstruction of all of these factors that lead to what we can say for sure or what we cannot say for sure happened on that night. Then the importance is that they draw their conclusions not based upon an empirical, this is what we see, therefore this is what must have happened. Rather, they do it in narrative format. And what they do is they connect the pieces of evidence together in the most likely way, narratively, that these things fit together based upon the evidence that is admissible on the table. Not based upon bad evidence, bad things that are said about this, not based upon hearsay from second, third, fourth people, not based upon maybe perhaps the letter given from New Zealand about the hot poker, because even the fact that it was a hot poker was in question, but rather based upon the evidence that we truly have established through our methodologies is reliable. This is exactly how we have to think about the resurrection. We first have to establish, what do we say is reliable? Why do we say it's reliable? And then say what is the most likely outcome of the evidence submitted. Not to say that this is foolproof, this is provable, this is take a book, drop it, and prove gravity's constant, but rather it is the narrative explanation of the most likely thing that happened. And this is what Wright is about to do with the narrative and the evidence of the bodily resurrection. Well, first of all, in order to situate the resurrection, we have to ask ourselves, what did the wider ancient Near East, what did the wider world think happened after you die? What did the wider world believe about life after death? And to hone in, what specifically around the time period in which these things are purported to have happened, what do all of the historical situatedness of this time tell us about the milieu in which this purported resurrection happened? In the ancient non-Christian world, Wright is fairly clear that the road to the underworld ran only one way. The underworld was not a two-way street. If you die, you are dead. You aren't coming back in any way, physically, in any way, shape, or form. Even the most famous writings about this in the Greek world, in Greek philosophy, make it very clear that Homer and Plato and the like recognize there ain't no coming back from death. In Homer's particular writings, you have shades of people who want bodies again, but can never have it. In Plato's philosophy, Plato even goes so far as to say it is better to be disembodied than to be embodied, because the body is only a shadow of the heavenly forms that are true and spiritual and good. The coming back from the dead was not only not seen as a possibility, it actually was, in some philosophical circles, frowned upon, looked down upon. Why would you want to come back from the dead? Why would you want to go back to a lesser form of life, to use Plato's philosophy in this case? And this is where we get into a linguistic question, because the word resurrection that appears in the New Testament is a Greek word. Anastasis is the Greek word that we use to talk about resurrection. But that word, linguistically, has a milieu that it occurs in way before the New Testament. What do Greek users before Jesus' time on earth say about what the word resurrection means? Well, looking at the literature around this word, anastasis, resurrection never meant life after death. Resurrection was something that the majority of the non-Christian world thought in the sense of bodily resurrection was absolute nonsense. The non-Christian world has nothing to do with bodily resurrection, especially around the Greek and Roman-speaking time. And to say that this was something that was a widely understood belief is to be somewhat historically anachronistic. The idea of resurrection being life after death rather meant more closely and more specifically the belief or the denial of the belief in the resurrection, that there was, at least at some point in time, a hope that maybe someday we'll have a body again. Now, Wright is very quick to point out the reason why it's important to say that this is a somewhat maybe hope is that it absolutely didn't mean, what it absolutely did not mean in the ancient world was what happens to someone right after they die. It absolutely did not mean the state of someone's life right at the moment when they pass from this physical life. It was not something that someone experiences when one dies and is taken to wherever they go after they die. Whether in the non-Christian world or in the Jewish or Christian context, this was not what resurrection meant. Resurrection meant, as you'll hear Wright come back to several times in this book, the belief in life after death. There is something that happens in the middle between someone's death bodily and someone's resurrection bodily, whether that happens or not. There's something that happens in the middle here. And what that is, we'll get into in later chapters. But what needs to be underscored is that resurrection did not mean what happens right after someone dies, and most definitely did not mean something that happens in the time in which we are in right now. The only exception to this rule, and this is something that those of you who might be historians and more historically minded might think about, is Zoroastrianism. There's an argument to be made that Zoroastrianism is, in some ways, an outlier that has a belief in some sort of resurrection that has to do with what happens right after someone dies. But Wright points out, as he does in another book of his, that the dating and the contextualization of the Zoroastrianism belief is somewhat difficult to pin down. Again, this evidence that we put forward to maybe put forward that there was some sort of idea of resurrection that was beyond the pale prior to Christianity is something that is epistemologically dubious. We're not sure that we can say this for sure. And so, again, we rely on the evidence that we can most assuredly say is most likely what the truth is. And what is the case in Wright's argument is that there is no idea that resurrection is something that happens in time. This is something that happens after all this stuff, and definitely not something that happens immediately after one dies. But something else that is really important about resurrection is that it has to do with something bodily. The word anastasis is something that refers to bodily function. And the thing is that the idea of resurrection as being some sort of immaterial resurrection is really not on the table as it comes to the first century. Even in Homer and Plato and many others, people wrote all about ghosts and spirits and demons and disembodied shades and things like that. That was something that was relatively commonly referred to within wider literature and things like that. In other words, the word resurrection was never meant to refer to something disembodied, which is why resurrection was such a looked down upon concept in Greek philosophy. Why would you want to come back bodily? Why would you want to put back on this moral coil, so to speak, instead of being released into the bliss of the eternal forms, as Plato would say? Well, resurrection, we start sharpening the focus, is actually extremely Jewish. The idea of resurrection is deeply Jewish. Now, not all Jews agreed as to whether there would be a bodily resurrection, but it is specifically Jewish in this context. Take, for example, the debates that we see in the Gospels themselves between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We know for a fact that the Sadducees were actually far more like their non-Christian counterparts in the world of philosophy, in that they did not believe there would be a bodily resurrection. And again, the interpretive key in some of the passages in which Jesus is debating the Sadducees most famously in the question about marriage is, note, the Sadducees bring up a bodily function. Marriage, in this case, is about procreation for the Sadducees in this argument. It's about a bodily function. And if they're supposed to be bodily functioning families in heaven, who are we to say whose wife that this person is when they die? Reference that particular occurrence in the Gospels if you want to see the wider story of that. But what should be obviously pointed out is that the Sadducees are attempting to demonstrate to Jesus how ridiculous the idea of an embodied experience of the afterlife is. Jesus responds with, rather, that they got the picture all wrong. Jesus absolutely affirms that there will be a bodily resurrection in the same sort of fashion that the Pharisees do. Because the Pharisees believe there is a bodily resurrection, but it's important to note the Pharisees believe in the bodily resurrection at the end of the age, or at the end of the world. When God comes back to establish forever the covenant with Israel and made known to the entire ends of the earth, then the bodily resurrection takes place. This is even seen in Martha's response to Jesus when Jesus goes to Lazarus' tomb after he had died. Martha says, "Lord, I know that there will be a resurrection at the end, and I know that I'll see my brother again in the bodily resurrection." A very Jewish thing to say. Jesus then says something very important. I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me shall not die, and those who come to me shall never die. That's radical. That is something new. And Wright points out that the Jewishness of the resurrection is sharpened in what the New Testament talks about in the resurrection. In this sharpening of focus, it's important to note that when Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God that is breaking into the world, his disciples understood a lot of that language. They recognized the Messiah. They recognized something about the inherited theology of, okay, God is getting ready to reestablish and make obvious the covenant with Israel, reestablish the kingdom, things like that. They knew the language of the kingdom breaking into the world. However, it's really important to note that whenever Jesus talked about his resurrection, the disciples had no idea what he was talking about. In fact, remember when Peter confesses him as Messiah, and then Jesus begins to tell the disciples he must suffer and die and then be raised from the dead? Peter took him aside and rebuked him. Not because of the resurrection piece, but because of, no, this must not happen to you, Lord. You must not die. Peter had no clue what to do with what his teacher was telling him, I will be raised on the third day. The disciples don't get it. They don't understand this, and it should be made very clear that the disciples understood this even to the very end when Jesus dies on the cross. The women go to anoint his body at the tomb not because they don't believe in the bodily resurrection at the end of the age, not because they don't believe that there is going to be a resurrection, an anastasis of the body. It's because they had no clue what the dude meant when he said he was going to be bodily raised in a resurrection in time. That was ridiculous, not just to Jews, but also to the wider world. So what exactly does it mean that Christians and the writings of the New Testament unwaveringly say that there was a anastasis of Jesus's very person that inaugurated something radically new about the world? So, as you can see about the resurrection, Christians are exactly square within the Jewish theological spectrum of resurrection. Resurrection meant bodies, and for that, Jews were very specifically particular in the wider non-Christian context of the ancient Near East. They were unique in this insistence on, or at least for some of them, the bodily resurrection at the end of the age. But Christians have a sharpened focus about the bodily resurrection in light of what they believe about Jesus. But again, we ask the epistemological question: how can we know for sure the truth of the matter of Jesus' bodily resurrection? In the New Testament, when Jesus teaches about resurrection, there are certain things that we have to understand as admissible pieces of evidence and those that are not. The first piece of admissible evidence is, what did Jesus teach about life after death? And it's very important to recognize that when we start talking about heaven, we begin speaking about something of an interstitial life, a middle point, rather than the ultimate hope that we will find within the rock-solid confession of the rest of the New Testament on into the early church's confession. When Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, we have all kinds of parables about the kingdom of heaven. And of course, as we pointed out last chapter, it is present tense language breaking into the world right now. Not someplace we go to at some point in time, but something that is happening right now. But a couple of passages that we can sometimes misinterpret because we don't get the full sense of the word, as Wright points out, is the teaching about what heaven is like in the parables. For example, Jesus' language to the disciples, I go to prepare a place for you. We can almost quote this, right? In my Father's house are many mansions, and I go there to prepare a place for you. We get this idea of, okay, the word mansion, right? In English parlance, especially in 21st century, mansion means giant house, big dwelling, an extravagant, luxurious thing. Things that celebrities and sports stars and politicians and things like that have the luxury of dwelling in. But that's not what that word is in the New Testament. When we see the word mansion, it is a specific Greek word, moni. And that word actually means temporary dwelling. Now, this is an important thing. think again about that particular saying of Jesus. In my Father's house are many temporary dwellings. I go to prepare a place for you. I am preparing a place for you in a temporary dwelling in my Father's house. Well, if we square this particular concept with the rest of what we see within the New Testament, especially as we talked about the revelation to St. John, this is a reference, Wright wants to argue, not to the ultimate destination of us going somewhere to be with God, but rather the waiting period. A period of peace, of dwelling with God, as we await the ultimate hope of Christian hope, which is the bodily resurrection at the end of the age. So again, do you see how Jewish this belief is? But do you see how focused this is when we bring Jesus' bodily resurrection into the case? So looking at this evidence that we are putting forward, rather than speaking about heaven as having many monies, we are saying heaven, or my Father's house, is a place that has many temporary dwellings that I am going to build for you, that you are going to dwell in the bigger hope of the bodily resurrection when heaven and earth are put together forever in the New Jerusalem, coming down to earth from heaven in the Revelation of John. Again, this is the vision that Wright wants to give you in contrast to the going somewhere else than down here in shabby old earth. Rather, there is a Jewish context that Christians understood in the first century, that we, many centuries later, have lost connection to, that we have to re-engage with, because it means everything for the way that our Christian hope operates, as he will demonstrate here in just a few minutes. But this also is very important when Jesus is on the cross and the thief that confesses Jesus as Lord, when Jesus turns to him and says, "Today you will be with me," where? In paradise. It's a specific reference that Jesus uses here. Notice Jesus doesn't say, "You're coming to heaven with me." That's not what Jesus says in any translation of what we get. Rather, we get this particular idea of paradise, and there's a fascinating relationship between what the word paradise has meant throughout the ages of the church. But Jesus is referring to something, is referring to a place in which they are going to, in which there is peace, there is dwelling together. You will be with me there. But if we then fast forward 3 days later, Jesus comes back bodily from the dead. Where's the thief if Jesus and the thief were dwelling together? And what does that mean if the thief's hope in the Christian context is in the bodily resurrection at the end of the age? Again, the Jewish concept of the bodily resurrection is so a part of the Christian confession, but the Christians differ in this very important hinge, that there was a person in time that came back from the dead in an anastasis. There was someone, one person, that has inaugurated an entirely new way that we view the universe now. There is nothing remotely close to this in non-Christian circles at this time. There is nothing close to this sort of confession. And the belief in resurrection, as has been again put forward, is that linguistically, culturally, and philosophically, resurrection is bodily. It has to do with bodily stuff. And resurrection, specifically, is Jewish in the ancient Near East. And not only that, Jews were the first people who confessed Jesus as Lord, Savior, Messiah, and God. Jesus is a Jewish man. The whole hinge right here is Jesus. Well, Wright gives us 7 ways in which this belief about the resurrection is modified from the Jewish context. And so take a quick listen This is a quick description. There's other things written about this, but here's what Wright says about the particular beliefs that are a modification of the Jewish belief. The first thing that we see that is specifically Christian is that in the early church, especially before the 3rd century, there's almost no spectrum of belief in Christianity about life beyond death. There's not a disagreement about bodily resurrection. In the early church, there was no spectrum of spiritual resurrection, yes, and bodily resurrection, yes. There was none of that until you get to later 3rd century writings. And what happens with that is that gives us really, really strong historical evidence that the Christian communities that exploded after the time of Jesus Christ and begin spreading throughout the Mediterranean, that they have a very concise and very clear, focused belief in the resurrection. That there is a bodily resurrection. There will be an ultimate bodily resurrection, and that there was a bodily resurrection of one particular person, Jesus Christ. And in this, there is no difference. This is the chief confession of Christians that is rock solid in the early church, and there's no differentiation between this. Wright points out that it takes Gnosticism, a heresy of the early church, to come in and start spiritualizing, and what I mean by spiritualizing is relativizing this idea of resurrection, making it non-physical. It is a spiritual resurrection that Christians have believed in. Of course it is. But spiritual resurrection in the early church meant bodily resurrection. Bodies are spiritual. And the bifurcation between the spiritual and physical is a Gnostic heresy that comes in the later church, that the church has to deal with, and the church actually rebuffs. There is not this divide between spirit and body. We are mysteriously one of these things because of the confession of the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, which was a spiritual and bodily real resurrection. Which leads into the second point, that in Second Temple Judaism, which is a reference to the time period that we're dealing with here, when the Second Temple was built, resurrection was a topic of discussion, but not an important topic of discussion. There were things written about resurrection, bodily at the end of the age, things like that, but it wasn't the hinge on which everything else turned upon. There were all kinds of other things for Second Temple Jews to speak about, write about, philosophize about, but something happens when this band of Jews who are being called Christians in Antioch in the early church, there's something that happened within this expression of Judaism that all of a sudden the resurrection of the body becomes the hinge point for everything else in the rest of the world. This eschatological, having to do with the end, belief in the resurrection of the body becomes the hinge point of all of the rest of theology. Where on earth did that come from? And how are we to explain this immense shift in this writing, as it comes to the New Testament, in comparison with Second Temple Judaism's writing? Why is there such a sharp focus on the bodily resurrection as being the thing that changes everything? And so, what does that mean for the resurrection and Christian belief in it? Well, mutation number 3, as N.T. Wright calls it, is what the resurrection means for us right now and in the future. He brings up an important passage in St. Paul. Now, you've heard me use the word spiritual earlier, and you've heard me clarify. Spiritual does not mean non-physical. That's not what that means in the ancient church. Spiritual is just as much a synonym for physical bodily stuff as it is for anything else. There is not a bifurcation between spiritual, physical. There's not that bifurcation. So when we read St. Paul in the first letter to the church at Corinth, when he speaks of 2 types of body, of this mortal body we we put away, and we put on the immortal body. We put away the rudimentary and put on the spiritual body. What Paul is most definitely not saying is that we are putting off the shabby physical and putting on the non-physical reality. That is not what Paul is saying. And with all of the evidence we talked about so far, we should be clear that is not what Paul is saying. Rather, what Paul is trying to describe is something indescribable, that we shall be like Christ in a resurrection like his. Paul says this all over the place in his letters. Whether it be the crucifixion, I am crucified with Christ, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives within me. And the life which I now live presently, I live for my Lord and Savior. But that Paul also is very clear in that in baptism, we are buried in a resurrection like his so that we may be raised in a resurrection like his. In other words, bodily. And again, that resurrection language is anastasis. It's referring to bodily stuff. And the Christian confession of this is so one-directional that this is what it means to believe in the hope of the world, in the anastasis of Jesus Christ, that permeates the rest of what we believe about that. And that is unique to the Christian confession in the first century. But the fourth interesting thing about this is an outcome of the first three, which is that in a fascinating move, and again, this is kind of an unprecedented move unless something really, really odd has happened, there is a splitting of the belief in the bodily resurrection into two separate time periods. There is the belief in the bodily resurrection at the end of the age. That's regular Judaism within the Pharisaic tradition and within those within Judaism who believe in these things, the Jewish believers of the first century. But there all of a sudden is a second period of time that is added. And it is the period after the bodily resurrection of a specific person, Jesus Christ. And this bifurcation, splitting in two of the anastasis, bodily stuff, end of the age and in current day, is nigh unexplainable unless there is something magnificently weird that happened. You don't just get a bifurcation, a wild bifurcation of the end of the age, but also somehow in the age, unless there is a incredible shift of some sort that has happened in either the thinking or the experience of the first century Jews who are writing about this. And as we maybe have demonstrated, it takes a lot of time to build theology around these certain things. Again, this was not an agreed upon point for all Jews. Some didn't think that the bodily resurrection happened at the end of the age. They thought much more like the non-Christian first century dwellers around that area did. There were some who did believe that, but there is no precedent for all of a sudden getting something, bam, in the span of 50 years, something that has happened in time that has split this time period into two. What on earth happened for this to happen and for this to be so solidly attested to in the writings of the early church and in all the way through the second century? This was unwavering. What happened during that time period to change the minds of so many and to have this new concept all of a sudden come out of nowhere? But between these two periods, the fifth interesting thing comes in, which is that it is not only that God has inaugurated something brand new, but rather that God has called us in present time to be a part of the breaking of the kingdom into the world. To use the metaphor in the Bible, we are the hands and feet of Christ. We are the body of Christ that is living, active, and is responsible for the living out of this hope. God ultimately brings it around, but we are called in our various giftings by the Holy Spirit that indwells within us to our various callings to bring about this thing. God brings it about through us. And it's important to note that it's not we who bring it around by our own power, but rather God working in us that happens. But the thing is that that's such a radically different way of viewing the world than at some point the bodily resurrection may or may not happen. But rather, it's a difference in perspective of the meaning. The resurrection of the body has happened. We are witnesses to that. And because we are witnesses to that, that changes everything about how we live right now. The sixth particular mutation is that this gives a little bit of light back on some metaphor and literal usages within the Old Testament and New Testament about resurrection. When you look at the Old Testament, we have a lot of metaphor for anastasis, for resurrection. Maybe one of the most vivid ones being the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel, when it is told to Ezekiel, prophesy to the dry bones, and they stand up, and all of a sudden flesh comes upon them, and skin comes upon them, but then they don't have any life in them, and then the Lord breathes into them new life. It's a powerful vision and metaphor for the restoration of a specific thing, Israel. It's the restoration of Israel, used as a metaphor in the vision of Ezekiel, and likewise in other places as well in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it takes on a new metaphorical language of baptism, like St. Paul says, but it is undergirded by a literal dimension. We have the metaphorical baptism, dying in a death like his, rising in a resurrection like his, so on and so forth. The powerful spiritual reality that we have in baptism, but it is predicated upon a literal happening. The literal raising of Christ Jesus from the dead. The literal ascension of him bodily into the heavenly realms. This idea of the literal and metaphorical takes on new meaning within the New Testament that otherwise would not have if there was not, again, a weird breaking in of a second time period of bodily resurrection in current time. And the seventh, which is historically the most obvious case, perhaps, within the New Testament's writing and within the Jewish writings of the first century, is that absolutely nobody expected the Messiah to die. Absolutely none of the disciples thought that Jesus was supposed to die. And the fact that Christians somehow believe not only that the Messiah had to die, but that the Messiah died for a specific purpose, and not just that, that the Messiah was raised again bodily, is something radically different about the Christian confession of the bodily resurrection as opposed to the kind of wider spread Jewish belief about the bodily resurrection at the end of the age. Nobody understood the identity of the Messiah as someone who was supposed to die. And this is, again, probably the most obvious difference between the Jewish heritage of the bodily resurrection and the Christian confession of the resurrection in Christ Jesus. What should be made abundantly clear by all of these 7 different mutations of a specifically Jewish belief in the bodily resurrection and the whole concept of resurrection in the wider milieu, it should be very clear there are some evidences and some theories put forward that don't seem to fit the first century evidence. One of the things that is common in modern day is a somewhat revisionist practice that wants to spiritualize in the manner of making it immaterial. In other words, resurrection is not a physical or material thing. This is a spiritual, in other words, unbodied reality. The problem that Wright wants to point out is that the attempts to do that with the New Testament, and the attempts to do that with the first century, and the attempts to do that with the philosophical background, historical background, and theological background that we deal with in the first century is that that theory lacks epistemological power. The things that are put forward, Wright wants to suggest, is that what we know for sure linguistically, historically, and otherwise, points us in a different narrative direction than the resurrection as being non-bodily. And the reason why it does that is because it doesn't fit with what we understand as being admissible evidence. We have talked about the historical situatedness of what it means for the resurrection. So linguistically, resurrection and the historical period behind the idea of resurrection makes it really, really hard to argue that Christians have always believed in a non-bodily idea of the resurrection. In fact, you could sort of make the argument that that's Gnosticism, a heresy of Christianity to believe in a non-bodily resurrection. And all of that goes back to the confession of Jesus as being bodily raised. And the fact that that seems to be rock solid for the first 200 years of the church, on into the Nicene Creed, on into the later confessions of the faith, that seems to be something that is non-negotiable. And if it is non-negotiable for Christians as we go along the historical time period, then Wright wants to say the reason why they say that is not because they decided something about that, not because the culture decided that for them, but rather because they experienced something that was an incredible break from what the wider world said about these things at the time. And that break was caused not merely by reflection on something, but by an experience of something. An experience of something that was indescribable. And that gets into the next chapter, which is the question of, well, if this is what we say happened, what do we historically say? What can we as historians say is reliable about this particular theological difference and mutation between the Jewish belief and the first Jewish followers of Jesus who said something radically unique about the resurrection?